In a packed courtroom in Fresno, California, the air was heavy not only with the lingering heat of a long summer day, but with the weight of a decision that would forever alter the course of a young man's life. Every eye in the room was fixed on Judge Malcolm Brewer, whose reputation for unwavering, swift, and uncompromising judgments had preceded him for decades. At 62 years old, with 35 years on the bench, Judge Brewer's face was as chiseled and resolute as the rulings he had handed down over the years, a living testament to the countless lives he had impacted with a single swing of his gavel. On that day, the defendant, 24-year-old Ryan Hale, stood at the defense table. His hands trembled ever so slightly, yet his gaze remained steady, a look born from a lifetime spent trying to prove his innocence against insurmountable odds. Ryan had always maintained that he was innocent, even during the investigation following the armed robbery of a downtown jewelry store, a robbery that left one man critically injured. He had vehemently proclaimed his innocence. But on this day, as Judge Brewer's deep baritone filled the courtroom, Ryan's voice was rendered mute by the heavy, damning evidence that had been amassed against him. The judge began, his voice resonant and grave. "You stand convicted by a jury of your peers for crimes that have inflicted irreparable harm on this community. Your actions were not merely reckless, they were calculated. And you have shown no remorse." In the back row, Ryan's mother, a woman whose eyes were filled with both maternal love and heartbreak, stifled a sob. She had once begged the court to see her son as more than just a case number, a living, breathing human being with dreams and potential. She recalled the days when Ryan had aspired to become a firefighter, a noble dream that now seemed tragically out of reach. Yet the evidence had spoken louder than any plea for leniency. Eyewitness accounts, grainy surveillance footage, and an anonymous tip that had sealed his fate. "I hereby sentence you to 60 years in state prison," declared Judge Brewer, as his gavel struck the oak block with a final, echoing sound that resonated through the courtroom with unyielding finality. For a moment, the world around Ryan seemed to pause. He stood there, his face stoic, his lips pressed into a thin line as if he were holding back words that he knew would never change the outcome. Gasps, whispers, and the frenzied scribbling of reporters' pens filled the space. In that instant, the world around him fell silent. With one last, lingering look at his mother, a look laden with both sorrow and silent defiance, Ryan was led away, his shackled footsteps receding down the long, echoing hall. After the sentencing, Judge Brewer returned to his chambers, the door shutting with a definitive click that isolated him from the chaos of the courtroom. He poured himself a cup of bitter black coffee, its dark liquid swirling as he stared into it, searching for some semblance of an answer. The day had been long, and in his mind, justice had been served, but deep within him a subtle unease began to fester, a nagging sensation that he could not quite shake. Little did he know that the truth he had so decisively buried that day would soon claw its way back to the surface, threatening to upend everything he believed in. The trial, later dubbed by local news outlets as the Hale robbery case, dominated headlines for weeks. The crime itself had been a spectacle, a masked gunman storming into Carter's Jewelers in downtown Fresno on a busy Thursday afternoon, brandishing a weapon and fleeing with over $150,000 in stolen goods. In the ensuing chaos, one store clerk, Samuel Gaines, had fought desperately for his life after being struck in the crossfire. Ryan Hale, a part-time mechanic with no prior criminal record, was arrested 2 weeks later after an anonymous caller reported that he matched the description of the suspect seen fleeing the scene. The prosecution's case against Ryan was damning. They connected him to the stolen goods recovered from a storage unit registered under his name. A grainy surveillance video showed a man with a similar build and gait to Ryan's, and eyewitnesses claimed they recognized his voice. The most damning evidence of all was the fingerprints found on the weapon left at the scene. Yet, despite the mountain of evidence, Ryan maintained his innocence. "I didn't do this," he had told the jury during his testimony. "I wasn't anywhere near that store. I've never even touched a gun." His alibi, that he had been working a double shift at an auto shop on the day of the robbery, crumbled under scrutiny when his boss admitted on the stand that he could not verify Ryan's whereabouts for the entire day. The prosecution's closing arguments were relentless. "This is a man who thought he could outsmart the law," the district attorney declared, pacing before the jury with fervor. "The evidence does not lie. The fingerprints do not lie. The witnesses do not lie." In stark contrast, Ryan's defense, though earnest, felt feeble. His lawyer pleaded, "There are holes in this case, doubts that should give this young man the benefit of the doubt." But his voice lacked conviction, and the jury remained unmoved. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the verdict was reached: guilty on all counts. Ryan did not flinch as the foreperson read the decision, yet the tightening of his jaw betrayed the inner turmoil that raged within him, a silent storm that would never be quelled. Judge Brewer, ever the epitome of impartiality, steeled himself to deliver what he believed was a sentence befitting the severity of the crime. To him, having encountered countless hardened criminals in his courtroom, men who had mastered the art of manipulation, Ryan was no different. As his gaze swept across the courtroom, it lingered on Ryan, searching desperately for any sign of remorse or redemption. When the sentence was finally pronounced, the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. A sigh of relief for the victims and their families, and a crushing blow for Ryan and his mother. Later that evening, as Judge Brewer signed the sentencing papers, a faint flicker of disquiet passed over his features. A subtle, unplaceable feeling that he dismissed as mere fatigue. What Judge Brewer did not know was that the trial had been only the beginning. The truth he had thought was laid to rest was not truly dead. It lay dormant, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment to re-emerge and shake the very foundations of the justice system. That moment began on an unremarkable Wednesday evening. In his study, illuminated by the warm glow of a solitary desk lamp and surrounded by cluttered stacks of legal briefs and case files, Judge Brewer contemplated the day's events. Retirement had often crossed his mind lately, but tonight there was work to be done. A new case had landed on his desk, one involving allegations of police misconduct so serious that it demanded immediate and undivided attention. As Brewer thumbed through the documents, something in an evidence log from a previous investigation caught his eye. At first, it appeared to be just another insignificant detail lost among a sea of paperwork, but then a single name leapt out at him: Ryan Hale. Brewer leaned back in his chair, frowning as he considered the possibility. It was not unusual for names to reappear in seemingly unrelated cases, but this instance felt different, unsettling, in a way he could not immediately articulate. He flicked the page with a sense of foreboding. His pulse quickened as he read the details. The log described the inventory of a police evidence locker containing items confiscated during a separate robbery investigation that had taken place around the same time as the Carter's jewelers case. One item in particular stood out: a gun whose description matched the weapon used in the robbery for which Ryan had been convicted. The most shocking aspect was that this gun had not been submitted as evidence during Ryan's trial. In fact, it had not been mentioned at all. Brewer leaned forward, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He cross-referenced the serial number with the documents from the trial and found it to be an exact match. Same make, same scratches on the barrel. Yet the report stated that this gun had been seized during an unrelated arrest 2 days after the robbery. "How is that possible?" he muttered under his breath, his heart pounding as he pieced together the implications. If the gun had been in police custody, then it could not have been the weapon used in the Carter's jewelers robbery. And if it was not the weapon, whose fingerprints had been left on it? A chill ran down his spine as he realized that something was profoundly amiss. For decades, Judge Brewer had navigated the labyrinth of the legal system, understanding all too well how easily critical details could be buried or overlooked. But this was no mere oversight. It felt intentional, as if someone had engineered a deception to ensure that Ryan Hale would take the fall. Determined to unearth the truth, Brewer requested the full case file for the unrelated robbery. It arrived the next morning in a thick folder brimming with police reports, photographs, and witness statements. The deeper Brewer delved into the file, the more the threads of corruption began to unravel. To his dismay, he discovered that the arresting officer in the unrelated case was the same detective who had testified during Ryan's trial. Then there was the anonymous tip, a detail Brewer had barely considered during the trial, that now seemed glaringly suspicious. He requested a subpoena for the Tiplin records, and with every passing hour his unease grew. When the documents finally arrived, Brewer's blood ran cold. The call had not come from a random citizen, but from a burner phone registered under the same name as the detective. The walls of his office seemed to close in as the horrifying realization struck him. Ryan Hale had been set up. The evidence had been manipulated. The testimony orchestrated. Brewer's stomach churned as he thought about the 60-year sentence he had handed down, a sentence that had shattered the life of a young man who might have been innocent all along. He had prided himself on upholding the law, but now the law he had once trusted felt like quicksand beneath his feet. He knew what had to be done, yet the path ahead was fraught with peril. Even as the weight of his discovery settled heavily on him, Judge Brewer made a choice. He would dig deeper, no matter the cost. The truth demanded to be revealed, and he was determined not to let it slip away. In the restless nights that followed, Judge Brewer barely slept. His mornings began with stacks of legal documents, and his nights ended with notebooks filled with hastily scribbled notes. The more he investigated, the darker the picture became. The first significant breakthrough came when Brewer met with an old colleague, a retired investigator named Daniel Hayes, at a dimly lit diner off Highway 99. Over cups of bitter coffee, Brewer laid out his troubling findings. Hayes, a man known for his no-nonsense demeanor and a remarkable knack for sniffing out corruption, listened intently. "This isn't just negligence," Hayes said, pushing his coffee mug aside. "If what you're saying is true, someone went to great lengths to ensure that kid took the fall." Brewer nodded grimly. "I need proof, Dan. Solid proof." Hayes agreed without hesitation, and within days, the two were neck-deep in police records, witness testimonies, and internal memos. What they discovered was staggering. Falsified reports, missing evidence logs, and witness statements that had been altered to support the prosecution's narrative. One witness in particular caught Brewer's attention. A store clerk who had initially identified another man as the suspect, only to later change his statement to implicate Ryan Hale. When Brewer and Hayes tracked this witness down to a cramped apartment on the outskirts of town, the man's story tumbled out in a torrent of guilt and fear. "I didn't want to do it," he confessed, his hands trembling. "Detective Lewis, he pressured me, said if I didn't, I'd be arrested for obstruction. I had no choice." The very name, Detective Lewis, sent a wave of anger surging through Brewer. This was the same officer who had submitted the false tip and concealed crucial evidence. As Brewer and Hayes continued their investigation, they uncovered a disturbing pattern. Detective Lewis had a long history of questionable tactics, intimidating witnesses, fabricating evidence, and coercing confessions. Yet his official record remained unblemished, shielded by layers of bureaucratic red tape. The breakthrough finally came when Hayes managed to recover deleted emails from Lewis's police account. One email in particular stood out. It was addressed to the district attorney and detailed a plan designed to ensure a conviction in the Carter's Jewelers case. Attached to the email was a list of fabricated evidence and doctored witness statements. Brewer felt a surge of rage as he read the email. The very system he had devoted his life to was rotten to its core. There was no time for despair, however. He now had the proof he needed, but exposing the truth would not be easy. Detective Lewis had powerful allies within the department, and Brewer knew that going public could cost him everything: his career, his reputation, even his safety. Yet, as he thought of Ryan Hale languishing in a prison cell for a crime he might not have committed, the decision became clear. "Go public," Brewer declared to Hayes one evening as they reviewed their findings, his voice low and resolute. "No matter what it takes." The very next day, Brewer filed a motion to reopen Ryan's case, attaching the damning evidence against Detective Lewis. The motion sent shockwaves through the courthouse. But Brewer was not finished. He also filed a formal complaint with the Department of Justice, calling for an independent investigation into Detective Lewis and the Fresno Police Department. The backlash was swift. Anonymous threats began pouring in, with Brewer receiving calls at odd hours, each call ending in heavy silence before the line went dead. Colleagues distanced themselves, and soon the media began to question his motives. Yet, Brewer stood firm. The truth was now out, and there was no turning back. As the storm around him grew ever more violent, Brewer realized that the fight was far from over. The hardest battles were still ahead. The fallout from his motion was immediate and explosive. Local headlines screamed accusations of corruption within the Fresno Police Department, and public outrage spread like wildfire, an outrage that had not been seen in decades. Brewer felt the full force of the scrutiny aimed directly at him. Some hailed him as a hero for seeking justice. Others labeled him a traitor to the system he had sworn to uphold. And it wasn't just public opinion that turned against him. Brewer began receiving threatening phone calls, each heavy with ominous silence, until one morning he stepped outside and discovered his car tires had been slashed. A crude note was scrawled on the windshield, warning him to drop it or else. Brewer had seen too many lives ruined by systemic failures to be intimidated now, and yet he had not expected the threats to escalate so quickly. Still, he refused to be cowed. Every time Brewer thought of Ryan Hale, young, determined, and heartbreakingly resigned to a fate he had not deserved, a fire ignited in his chest. Meanwhile, Detective Lewis was not about to go down without a fight. Through his attorney, Lewis vehemently denied the allegations, claiming that Brewer's motion was nothing more than a baseless vendetta designed to tarnish his career. Lewis declared in a televised interview, his polished demeanor belying the mounting evidence against him. Brewer watched that interview from his living room, his jaw clenching with frustration. The lies were bold, calculated, and designed to mislead, but Brewer had something Lewis did not: the truth. As the investigation progressed, Hayes unearthed a critical piece of evidence: security camera footage from a parking lot near Carter's Jewelers, recorded on the day of the robbery. This footage, which had inexplicably never been submitted during Ryan's trial, showed a man matching Detective Lewis's physical description leaving the scene with a duffel bag. Brewer's heart pounded as he reviewed the tape. It was not just exculpatory, it was damning. With this footage, the pieces fell into place. The robbery had not been a random act of violence. It had been orchestrated by Detective Lewis himself. The next step was clear, though perilous. Brewer called for an emergency hearing to present the new evidence. The courtroom was tense as the footage was projected on a large screen before the packed gallery. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the reality of the situation sank in. "This man," Brewer said, gesturing emphatically to the screen, "is the same detective who led the investigation against Ryan Hale. He manipulated the evidence, coerced witnesses, and framed an innocent man to cover his own tracks." The reaction was immediate. Reporters scrambled to capture every moment, their flashes illuminating the courtroom like strobe lights. Detective Lewis, sitting in the gallery with his lawyer, looked pale but defiant. "You're making a mistake, Judge Brewer," he hissed as he was escorted out in handcuffs. "You don't know what you've started." The confrontation left Brewer shaken but resolute. The case was now in the hands of a higher court, and Ryan Hale's conviction was under re-examination. Yet Brewer knew this was not the end. It was merely the beginning of a much larger battle. As the courtroom emptied that day, Brewer sat quietly, contemplating the enormity of what he had uncovered. The truth was now out, but the fight for justice was far from over. Weeks later, Judge Brewer returned to the same courtroom where Ryan Hale had once been sentenced. This time, the atmosphere was palpably different. The gallery was packed with reporters, activists, and members of Ryan's family, all waiting for the presiding judge to render his decision in the retrial. Ryan, now visibly thinner and aged by his time in prison, sat quietly at the defense table. Despite everything he had endured, his posture remained steady and his gaze unwavering, a silent testament to his inner strength. Judge Brewer felt a lump form in his throat as he watched Ryan, the young man who had become the center of this storm, who had suffered for a crime he insisted he did not commit. The overwhelming evidence that Brewer and Hayes had painstakingly uncovered, surveillance footage, falsified reports, coerced testimonies, all pointed to a web of corruption so deep that it had framed Ryan and shielded the true criminals. When the presiding judge finally announced his decision to overturn Ryan's conviction, the room erupted in a tumult of applause and tears. Ryan's hands trembled as his mother rushed forward to embrace him. For a brief, miraculous moment, time seemed to stand still. Seated quietly in the back of the courtroom, Judge Brewer allowed himself a rare smile. Justice, it appeared, had finally been served, and yet he knew that the journey to this moment had come at an enormous cost. In the days that followed, the fallout spread far and wide. Detective Lewis faced criminal charges for his actions, and an independent investigation into the Fresno Police Department revealed a deeply entrenched culture of corruption that had persisted unchecked for years. The case ignited nationwide calls for reform, and Judge Brewer's courageous stand became a rallying cry for accountability within the justice system. Despite the accolades and public support he received, Brewer remained introspective. He understood that this victory was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The system he had once trusted was flawed, but he believed it was not beyond repair, and he was determined to devote the remainder of his career to making it better. For Ryan Hale, the journey was only just beginning. Freed from the crushing burden of a wrongful conviction, he vowed to dedicate his life to helping others who had been unjustly imprisoned. His story, though born of immense pain, became a beacon of hope for those who believed in the power of resilience and the pursuit of truth. The story of Ryan Hale and Judge Brewer is a powerful reminder that justice is not infallible. It requires constant vigilance, courage, and a willingness to confront even the most uncomfortable truths. In the months and years that followed, the Hayes family's experience, along with Judge Brewer's determined fight for justice, sparked a broader movement for systemic reform. Local organizations began hosting town hall meetings and public forums, inviting citizens to share their own stories of injustice and to demand higher standards of accountability from law enforcement agencies. Angela Hayes, whose own ordeal had become intertwined with these broader issues, emerged as a passionate advocate for change. In interviews and public appearances, she would say, "It isn't just about what happened to me. It's about what we do to ensure it never happens to anyone else." Her words resonated deeply with a generation of activists, inspiring countless others to speak out against abuse and discrimination. Malcolm Hayes, too, took decisive steps. As the newly appointed police commissioner of Dallas County, he spearheaded a series of reforms aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within the police force. New training programs were implemented that emphasized de-escalation techniques and the elimination of implicit bias. Furthermore, a citizens' advisory board was established, providing a direct channel for residents to voice their concerns and hold the department accountable. Although the road ahead was long and fraught with challenges, Malcolm's unwavering commitment to justice and reform instilled hope in a community that had long been overlooked. Together, the Hayes family transformed that night of humiliation into a catalyst for sweeping change. Their journey demonstrated that even in the face of systemic corruption, the courage to stand up for what is right could ignite a movement that, they believed, would ultimately redefine the very notion of justice. Real change, they maintained, begins with accountability and the willingness to confront entrenched power structures head-on. Their message was simple yet profound. Every voice matters. Start today. Speak up. Push for change. As the impact of that fateful night spread throughout the community, countless citizens, moved by Angela's dignified composure and Malcolm's steadfast leadership, began demanding a higher standard of accountability from their public institutions. The incident, widely dubbed the Hayes Incident, quickly became a rallying cry for reform. News reports, social media discussions, and community meetings all centered on the idea that no one, regardless of their status, occupation, or skin color, should ever be treated with such blatant disrespect. Judge Brewer's press conference marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Fresno Police Department and the justice system as a whole. His insistence on transparency and systemic change forced not only his department, but also other law enforcement agencies to re-examine their practices. For Angela, the ordeal reaffirmed her commitment to justice. She continued to share her story, not out of anger but out of hope, believing that by challenging injustice, they could build a fairer, more compassionate society. The journey of Ryan Hale and Judge Brewer serves as a powerful reminder that the pursuit of justice is an ongoing battle. It requires constant vigilance and the courage to expose and confront the uncomfortable truths that lie beneath the surface. The case revealed that even a system founded on the ideals of fairness and accountability can be subverted by corruption and manipulation. And it is a call to action for every citizen to speak out when they witness injustice, to support organizations that fight for the wrongfully convicted, and to demand systemic reform from those in power. So, as you reflect on this story, ask yourself, what can you do to make a difference? Whether it's by speaking out against inequality, by challenging the status quo in your community, or by treating every person with the dignity and respect they deserve, your actions matter. Start today. Speak up. Push for change. Because together, our collective voices have the power to build a future where justice is not merely an ideal, but a living, breathing reality for all. The legacy of this case is not defined solely by the 60-year sentence once handed down in a packed courtroom. Rather, it is defined by the movement it sparked. A movement that transcends individual trials and reaches into the very heart of our society. It is a testament to the fact that the fight for justice does not end in the courtroom. It begins with each one of us standing up for what is right, even when it is uncomfortable or unpopular. In the end, the story of Ryan Hale and Judge Brewer is a call to action, a reminder that every act of courage in the face of injustice contributes to the creation of a more just and equitable society. It teaches us that real change requires more than just the application of the law. It requires a relentless commitment to truth, accountability, and the fundamental belief that every individual deserves to be treated with respect. As you carry this story with you, remember that your voice matters. Stand up for what is right, speak out against injustice, support those who strive to correct systemic wrongs, and never underestimate the power of collective action. Together, we can forge a future where justice is not only an abstract ideal, but a tangible reality that uplifts every member of our community. This is the legacy of Ryan Hale, the resolute determination of Judge Brewer, and the unwavering commitment of the Hayes family. A legacy that reminds us that the journey toward justice is never truly complete, but that every step we take in its direction brings us closer to a fairer world. Let their story inspire you to challenge the status quo, to demand accountability from those in power, and to work tirelessly to ensure that every human being is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. For in the end, the true measure of our society lies not in the perfection of its institutions, but in the courage and compassion of its people.